There are times in history when silence begins to feel like a voice. When the quiet tension in people's faces says more than speeches or headlines. When churches are still open, prayers are being said, Mass is still celebrated, yet something feels different. Not loud, not dramatic, not even visible to the untrained eye, but spiritually unmistakable. It is as though something has shifted in the soul of the Church. Something subtle but profound. Some say it feels as though a spiritual season has ended, and we have unknowingly stepped into another, one that is clouded, delicate, marked by a deeper testing of faith. It feels like walking into a room that is perfectly familiar, yet sensing something has changed, though nothing visible has. In countless parishes, this feeling lives quietly, not in debates, but in hearts. In elderly women who have prayed the rosary their entire lives. In humble priests who faithfully kneel before the tabernacle. In teachers and seminarians, in bishops and students, in young families raising children in the faith. None of them are claiming visions or making dramatic predictions. But many say they feel a certain tremor in their spirit, something like what the mystics called holy trembling. That blend of anticipation and concern, neither fear nor excitement, but a reverent awareness that God might be speaking in whispers rather than thunder. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. In these times, old prophecies, once dismissed as exaggerated or symbolic, have begun to resurface, not because people went searching for them, but because they suddenly seem to describe what many hearts are quietly sensing. It is like reading an old letter and realizing, for the first time, that it was written for you. Prophecies that were once sealed away, forgotten in archives or overshadowed by history, now echo through the unease and questions of the present moment. For centuries, Catholics thought that the greatest danger to the Church would be persecution from outside, tyrants, revolutions, or atheistic ideologies. But many ancient prophecies speak of a more delicate threat, a more painful and confusing one, a trial that would come not from the outside but from within. Not a crisis of survival but of clarity. Not about the power of the Church, but her identity. Warnings about a time when counterfeit voices would rise within the heart of the Church, confusing the faithful not by what they openly deny, but by what they subtly alter. Among all prophecies, one stands out, La Salette. Approved by the Church, it did not speak with symbolism or poetic allegory. It spoke plainly. It spoke about corruption among shepherds, about Rome facing confusion, about a moment when spiritual illusion would try to imitate the true voice of the Church. It even spoke specifically of a time when there would be two false shepherds, two who sat in seats of authority, appearing holy but lacking the true light, before the arrival of a holy pope whose reign, though luminous, would be short. For over a century, parts of this message were sealed and set aside, considered too unsettling. Until 1999, when long-hidden texts resurfaced, like a breath finally released after being held for a lifetime. These texts echoed not just La Salette, but the warnings of Anne Catherine Emmerich, Padre Pio, Blessed Anna Maria Taigi, Marie-Julie Geheny, Garabandal, Kitor, and others. All of them had spoken, in different words and visions, of a future moment when truth and imitation would stand side by side. Some spoke of two shadows of Peter. Others of two popes who were not both true. Others described a counterfeit church, one that looked Catholic, sounded Catholic, but lacked the divine fire. This is why, in recent years, more ordinary Catholics have begun to ask questions that previous generations never did. Not because they want rebellion or division. Not because they do not love the Church. No, it is precisely because they love her. And love, when it is deep and true, learns to recognize when something is amiss. When something is said in the name of Christ that no longer carries the breath of Christ. When something looks holy, yet feels hollow. When the church is still beautiful, but somehow less radiant. Mystics described this time not as a crisis of force, but a crisis of spiritual perception. A time when messages would sound good, compassionate, even wise, but somehow lack the unmistakable sharpness of divine truth. A time when teachings become cloudy, not because they reject truth, but because they soften it. And in that softening, something precious is lost. Blessed and Catherine Emmerich once described seeing two papal figures. One wore white and stood among crowds, loved by many, speaking of openness, mercy, and unity, yet his words felt strangely lacking in divine clarity. The other was sorrowful, humble, kneeling in a small chapel, surrounded by a little flock, praying, weeping, and holding tightly to the eternal truth. Emmerich emphasized that the danger would not be about politics or personalities, but about spirit. About the difference between a voice of the world and a voice of the cross. She described the counterfeit church, beautiful, elegant, inclusive, compassionate, gathering crowds, yet slowly losing its spiritual substance. A church that spoke about Christ, but began to forget why he was crucified. A church that felt emotionally comforting, but spiritually empty. She saw priests drifting into spiritual fatigue, doctrines becoming unclear, and the supernatural fire fading. Yet, in this same vision, she saw something else, a small hidden remnant. Not loud, not rebellious, not aggressive. They were silent, kneeling, adoring the Eucharist. They fought not with hostility, but with holiness. She said these were not the loudest, but the most faithful. Not the ones making speeches, but the ones making sacrifices. Not experts in theology, but experts in adoration. These are the souls who would recognize, even without arguments, the difference between imitation and truth, because their hearts were trained in prayer. They did not recognize truth with their minds alone, but with their souls. In Fatima, the third secret hinted at a time of deep trial in the Church. Some interpretations speak of a pope walking among ruins, heading toward martyrdom. Others speak of him facing his own reflection, perhaps reflecting the spiritual battle between authenticity and imitation. Not two physical popes, but two spiritual influences. One echoing Christ, the other echoing the spirit of the world. In this spiritual climate, the question unfolds, how do we know which voice is true? Mystics say, look to the Eucharist. Truth radiates from the blessed sacrament. Falsehood cannot kneel for long. Counterfeit faith resists silence, prayer, and sacrifice. True faith kneels, weeps, and adores. It carries weight. It leads to conversion. It pierces hearts rather than entertains minds. Mystics insist, do not chase every rumor. Do not obsess over supposed secrets. Do not argue endlessly, trying to prove who is right. Instead, settle your heart before the tabernacle. The closer you are to Jesus in the Eucharist, the easier it will be to see through confusion. The one who lives from the Eucharist will have clarity, even when events grow darker. Across different prophecies, a striking pattern appears. Eventually, after a time of spiritual fog and confusion, there will come a holy pope, a saintly shepherd, whose reign will be brief but radiant. His voice will not be political or ideological. It will be quiet, sorrowful, pure, and filled with the fire of adoration. He will not speak much, but when he does, his words will cut through confusion like light through mist. People will not gather around him because of debate, but because his presence will feel like truth. His task will not be to change structures, rewrite laws, or modernize doctrines, but to bring back reverence. To restore what was forgotten, the sacredness of the Mass, the silence of prayer, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They call him the Pope of the Eucharist. His reign will be short not because he is weak, but because his role is not to construct, it is to illuminate. Light does not stay long to argue with darkness. It simply arrives, and darkness flees. His presence will expose what is imitation, what is counterfeit, what is merely spiritual decoration without supernatural life. Marie-Julie Jahenny described him as a man who will not rule with strategy, but with prayer. A man whose tears will speak more loudly than speeches. He will kneel more than he will stand. He will restore not through new programs, but through holiness. The faithful will recognize in him the Father of the Church, not because he claims the title, but because his soul carries the heart of Christ. And when he dies, the mystics say, people will not mourn as they mourn ordinary leaders. They will feel as though something luminous had briefly passed through the earth, leaving behind a softened sky. His time will feel like sunrise, brief, bright, but unforgettable. Many prophecies even describe that his arrival marks not the end of suffering, but the beginning of purification. His light exposes shadows. His holiness burns away what is false. Some say he will suffer deeply, both spiritually and physically, not as punishment, but as intercession. He will carry pain not for himself, but for the Church. And after his passing, some visions speak of a silence. A spiritual emptiness. Not despair, but a pause. Like the Church holding her breath. Like Holy Saturday, when Christ had died, but darkness had not yet understood that dawn was coming. What comes after that remains hidden. Some speak of renewal. Some of martyrdom. Some of great clarity. But almost all agree, after the Holy Pope, the Church will never be the same. Perhaps that is the point of these prophecies. Not to predict. Not to reveal exact names or dates. But to prepare hearts for a deeper kind of faith. Not a faith rooted in personalities, controversies, or rumors, but anchored in the Eucharist. A faith that knows the difference between noise and truth. Between imitation and grace. A faith that is not restless, but rooted. In the end, what all these prophecies call for is not panic, rebellion, or speculation, but holiness. Not argument, but adoration. Not outrage, but fidelity. They call us not to find answers, but to find Christ. Because the one who remains close to him, truly close, will not be deceived. Maybe we are in those times. Or maybe they are still coming. Or maybe we are being slowly prepared, one silent nudge at a time. But even if we do not know for certain, we know this: confusion is always conquered not by cleverness, but by holiness. The Church will not be rescued by debates, but by saints. The remnant will not be the loudest, but the most prayerful. Those who endure will be those who do not just know about Christ, but live from him, especially in the Eucharist. And so, perhaps the most prophetic act left to us in these times is also the simplest. To kneel. To adore. To be faithful. To stay, quietly, in his presence, because even in silence, truth speaks. And when it speaks, every imitation fades. If this message touched your heart, comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.